Hello and welcome to the last part of Chapter 5 and the last part of our course for this semester. Last time we covered the second part of Section 1 in which we discussed 9 methods or perspectives related to second language teaching over the years. Today we will be covering classroom instructional issues, that is, issues related to language teaching based on the methods or approaches that we had discussed in the previous lectures. Let's remember the hypotheses that are related to instructional issues and the hypotheses that are related to modern-day language classrooms. We have Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, in which he talked about noticing input and its importance in reaching intake, in which input actually is absorbed by the learner and in which it stays in the memory of the learner. And this happens, intake happens when the learner notices input. Van Patten's input processing hypothesis, and if you remember, Van Patten discussed processing incoming information in which the learner notices, and then whatever the information that the learner receives moves to the short memory, and when practiced or rehearsed, it moves to the long-term memory. And if it's not practiced, the information related to language will decay, that is to be lost. And finally we come to Long's interaction hypothesis, and if you remember, this is about speech adjustments, conversational modifications between a learner and a native or native-like speaker of the target language, and Long talked about corrective feedback. So let's see the instructional issues related to these 3 hypotheses that we will be discussing today. How can a teacher improve the experience of learning a second language? We have the concept of focus on form, corrective feedback, the issue of using L1 in the language classroom, and finally using technology in language teaching. Let's start by focus on form, which is also known as form-focused instruction. So when you see any of these terms, they mean the same thing. And when we're talking about form here, we mean language forms. That is, anything related to language features or aspects, whether it's grammar, morphology, syntax, spelling, pronunciation, phonology, phonetics, whatever, all of this is considered part of form. Now, form-focused instruction is based on the communicative approach, and by focusing on form, we are actually drawing the attention of the learner to the formal features of the language, such as grammatical features. So when we say language forms, as I said earlier, we mean anything related to language, all the skills that you learn as a language learner, okay? And drawing attention happens through communication and going through negotiation for meaning, okay? So this action of drawing learners' attention actually happens either implicitly, that is indirectly, or explicitly, directly. Example: when an ESL teacher, for example, in a conversation says the word homework, and then while the teacher is talking says a certain note to the side, please note or notice that the word homework does not take S. She can say, he or she can say, the word homework is non-count noun, so we do not put S for homework, even if we are using it, we mean it in the plural form. Therefore, we would say something like, I have a lot of homework, or I have some homework. We do not say I have many homeworks. So this way is an indirect way of drawing the attention of students to language forms, not through teaching grammar. So the lesson would not be titled non-count nouns and then a list of non-count nouns. No, the lesson could be something related to education, for example, a certain theme, and then these language forms are pointed out in a natural way when they happen. Therefore, drawing attention can happen in several ways, and this is what I was talking about, this point here. The teacher draws the student's attention when they occur incidentally in lessons, okay? Not a formal grammatical lesson. And the lesson would focus either on meaning or communication, again, because we are talking about the communicative approach of teaching a language. Therefore, there is however, when teaching adults, attention to form can be explicitly taught by having like a separate teaching session about non-count nouns in this example, because learners who notice more learn more. Now this brings us to two concepts related to input enhancement and input flooding. As you know, the word enhance means to improve, and the word flood means to overflow. Okay, usually it's about water, but here we're not talking about water, we're talking about language. So how does it happen? Input enhancement. How do I improve input? Schmidt's noticing hypothesis emphasized how important it is that students or learners notice the input, okay? That is the correct input. And this leads us to intake. So what leads input to become intake? According to Schmidt and other noticing hypothesis proponents, through these two ways, input enhancement and input flooding. Input enhancement, what do we mean by this? It is something that you are exposed to all the time, and it's something that I've done over and over again in all your PowerPoint presentations. It is to have it is done in a variety of ways, such as typographical changes like underlining, italicizing, and bold type, asking students to pay attention to something by circling or underlining it, or for example differentiating through coloring, uppercase, etc. This can be digitally, or maybe on worksheets, or maybe on the whiteboard when the teacher is explaining something. Input flooding is about overflowing students with correct input, okay, by exposing learners to a substantial, huge amount of input. And when I say input, we mean correct input about a certain linguistic feature. You may refer to our recorded sessions for more examples on this. Alright, so these huge number of instances of the correct form eventually, according to them, leads to mastery. However, it has been argued, according to studies, that this is not always effective. Input flooding is not always effective because there are students who still don't notice correct forms even when they are exposed a lot to it, if they don't have explicit explanation. The second concept here is processing instruction. What do you mean by this? Traditional L2 techniques always suggested intervening, that the teacher would intervene at the output phase. That is, after the learner produces something, the teacher would give feedback and correct for the learner in order to teach grammatical patterns. However, according to the processing instruction, interference should happen at the input phase. Before learners start producing output, the teacher should do certain activities that ensure that the learner has acquired the grammatical form correctly. Not the grammatical, I mean the language form, whatever it is. So, how does it happen? Learners are put in situations where they must rely on language form to understand. That is, the teacher, it's something that takes some work. The teacher should structure a certain activity that involves language forms. Remember that Van Patten stipulated that learners cannot focus on form and meaning at the same time. Therefore, Learners should be able to recognize the language form in order to understand meaning, to make meaning of what they are reading or listening to. There would be no contextual clues or prior knowledge. It's something new and they won't understand it except if they know the form. Therefore, the input needs to be organized according to Van Patten to draw the attention to meaning. And he proposed 3 main features, like how the stages, how does it happen? First, the teacher would provide explicit information about the structure, okay, whether it's grammar, something related to phonetics, whatever. Provide explicit information about the processing strategies. What do you mean by processing strategies? It is when the teacher is leading the learners on how to think about the rule or the grammar form and how to make meaning out of it. And finally, the teacher would provide structured input activities in which the learners should rely on form to get the meaning. There is an example on page 122 on the textbook. You could please read it if you haven't attended the session, and you could also watch the recording of the session in which I discuss this example fully. Now let's move to corrective feedback, which is related to Long's interaction hypothesis. How should errors be corrected? According to Long's hypothesis, interaction, okay, specifically as interaction can actually help in second language development. Therefore, there must be a type of corrective feedback, whether it's explicit or implicit. According to Lister and Ranta in 1997, they examined 6 types of oral, focus here on the word oral, because we're talking about a communicative approach, okay? So it would be related to the method of direct method, Berlitz's method, or CLT, or for example, a TBLT. We have recasts, that is, rephrasing the incorrect utterance correctly. Elicitation, when the teacher does not complete the sentence, the teacher would reach the wrong word and then have the student prompt the student to correct themselves. Clarification request, as in the teacher asking the student, what do you mean? Excuse me, could you repeat that again? Asking for clarification. Metalinguistic feedback, that is when the teacher points out the utterance is incorrect without providing the correction, explaining a rule but not giving the correct answer. Finally, we have explicit correction. The instructor directly gives the student the correct form. And finally, repetition, that is repeating the phrase as it is without correcting it. This is how recasts and repetition differ. Recast provides a correction, while repetition does not provide a correction. You can see here a set of examples. I also explained them in the recorded session. You can please read them, and if you have any questions, let me know. Now we come to the other part of corrective feedback. Proponents also proposed the concept of uptake. What we mean by uptake is whatever the learner utters following what the teacher gave in feedback and incorporating, that is, using the correct form. This shows whether the teacher's feedback is successful or not. So if the student utters let's look here, for example, in a clarification request. The student said she bought new staff. Here she meant stuff. And the teacher said, excuse me, she bought what? If the student replies to this teacher's question, she bought a new stuff, and the student corrected themselves, it means they have uptake. Alright? Or for example, I take the bus this morning. I take the bus. The student would say, I took the bus. This is uptake.